Oh. Let me see for a second. All right. So, laissez-faire. These are different types of, where are we here? Names and faces in leadership, of leadership. So, we do have the political spectrum, but there are also other factors that go into leaders. So within leaders, within political spectrums, there can be also different types of leaders, obviously, and vice versa. And it's not just a left and right leaning type of situation for those of you that remember grade 10 civics. And we'll kind of go through these in a general way right now. The leadership style of laissez-faire. In French, that means basically let it go. So when we talk about politics, a government that is laissez-faire, there's a little bit of very little participation. They are authoritarian. It seems to be something that works when the leaders or the people in the government are similar in level, if you will. And in this style, there's no authoritative sort of role. Kind of like Gage says in his 1983 book, the principle of letting people do as they please. Basically, there are a set of rules, sort of, but nothing so stringent that there's no oppression. It's a laid-back approach. The exact opposite of laissez-faire is, anyone give us an example of a current leader that we see in the news? No? Donald Trump, maybe?
Kim Jong-un.
Yeah. Or his potential successor, right? And there's no force. It's the opposite of force. So if there is a idea that needs to be implemented by the government or the leader, typically, there's no force in saying this will be the way. There could be suggestions or, nudging, if you will. Let's go this way. But it's a much more laid back approach. Now, remember, when we look at these political ideas, we're going to try to be as neutral as possible. So you can obviously have judgments on them yourself, but it's important that we keep the judgment educated, and we really learn about things before we make irrational sort of statements, if you will. Now, of course, democracy is not as easy as a simple, this country is democratic. As we've seen, many countries are democratic, but work very differently. The United States is a democratic country. Canada is a democratic country, yet both are run by very different types of governments and different types of leaders. One thing that does bind democratic governments together in terms of what makes them democratic is the decisions are made through group discussions and votes. Even how that happens varies greatly between governments. For instance, in the United States, when laws are passed, often things are voted on specifically by people. Cannabis legalization in the United States is very different than cannabis legalization in Canada, for example. In Canada, people elected a political party where one of the ideas on their platform was that they would legalize cannabis. And so once that party, the Liberal Party, won the majority vote the first time around, now they're a minority, they implemented the legalization process. In the United States, the question appears on the ballot. Do you wish to legalize cannabis? Yes, no. And so both are decisions made by people, though indirectly and directly, right? So you remember when we talked about in civics direct democracy and indirect democracy. The democratic process is through the people, and directly, or like I said, directly or through or indirectly. Ideally, a government that is controlled by the people who live under it, again, differs in different countries. So, in Canada, we have elections typically every 4 years. And that's when we get to have our say, really. We get to have our say by electing the members of parliament, locally or provincially or federally, that we think are going to, that we think follow the ideas that we have personally, right? India, United States are the largest democracies. Some countries have the word democratic in their name, but they are not democratic. For instance, North Korea. I believe there are other countries like that as well. Now, though in democratic countries like Canada, there's a leader, that leader does not have as much power as one does in a more right-leaning country, less democratic country, right? An autocratic system, typically one person makes the decisions, right? Now, in the last 7 months in Canada and around the world, we've seen situations in political countries where certain decisions which would normally have been made through the process of democratic countries has been through emergency in terms of this time around COVID. Situations have been changed so that they can be passed much faster. Because as we all know, we've learned in democratic countries, decisions take much, much longer than they do in, for instance, autocratic countries where one or a small amount of people make the decisions, right? So in autocratic situations, governments have absolute power over citizens, absolute authority. They can basically do anything they want. The Soviet Union disbanded in 1991, and many countries that were communist before, and basically on paper, communism is very different than it is in real life, have been left with leaders who are basically autocratic, right? They determine all the policies and give orders. Cuba, Vietnam, Laos, China, Korea, North Korea, these are countries which on paper are communist, but in reality they're autocratic. The decisions are made by one person or a family of people or a small group of people. Now, everyone, by definition, in that country as citizens are equal, but in reality, they are very much not, right? So let's take a look at the different political classifications. A supranational political system. So That's the fancy word basically for, empires. Most famous in history would be the British Empire through history, Roman Empire, to less famous but also quite powerful empire, the Ottoman Empire. And basically, these empires historically, controlled other regions, not just the region that they exist, right? So if you look at the tiny little map on the screen, can you see my cursor? Or just, you can see my cursor, right? Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can.
There. So that's Britain, right? And in that little area, arguably there's 3 or 4 different countries, right? Is Wales a country? Yes, no, that's something up for debate. Ireland, Scotland, Britain, or sorry, England. And then we see that's Great Britain. But of course, Great Britain was an old saying that they had, the sun never sets on the British Empire. So many countries, Canada included, Australia, New Zealand, many, even India, were controlled by the British for a very long time. And, lots of territory, lots of people under one single authority. The Roman Empire, similar. Ottoman Empire, similar. So many languages controlled by one, and cultures controlled by one. There are also supranational political systems that include leagues, which are not quite empires. They're definitely not empires, but they're almost like associations of nations, or groups of nations, allies, if you will, that share similar beliefs, have a understanding, legally usually, that they are together, right? They have each other's backs. The common purpose binds them together, right? So an Arab League, Baltic League, League of Nations, we've seen through history, and so forth. We also see confederations. So one of the most famous one is the European Union. It is many countries in Europe, not all countries in Europe, together with the same money, yet the system of government that controls the overall European Union doesn't really have much power. Each one is self-governing. Now, the United States is actually very similar to this, hence the word the United States. Now, when we hear the word state, what do you think of? Anyone?
Florida.
Okay, so you think of one of the American states. But when we talk about politics, we hear the word state.
Basically just like provinces, but more independent.
I think a state is like any organized political body that is recognized by other states.
Right. So typically states is just that, right? We use the word state, many people interchange them as sort of a country is a state, United States is states. And in the United States, there are really 50 separate entities. And so although they have a federal, one flag, each star is basically their own nation, basically, right? With their own governing laws, etc. So if we go back to the idea of cannabis legalization, in the United States federal law, cannabis is illegal. But within many states, they have voted to legalize cannabis. So it's a weird gray area because it's still illegal by the federal government standards, but because the United States is designed to have independence from each other, basically, they were able to, legalize it separately. So which one supersedes? Does the state government have more power than the federal government, or does the federal government have more power over the state government? And this is an ongoing problem in the United States because they're often they fight each other almost. When cannabis first became legal in Colorado, federal government was trying to shut everyone down and catching people and closing down stores that were, according to Colorado state law, legally open, but according to federal government law, they were not. And so it's an interesting way of doing things. Going back to European Union, they have a flag, they have a government, but it really is still self-governing regions. Though the money, which is not shared by every single European Union country, the euro, many euro countries under the European Union are still not allowed to use the euro money. It's interesting. Then we have federations. The USSR was one of the most famous federations. Basically, by force, political units or states were surrendered their individual sovereignty and were taken over by a central authority based in Russia. Countries like Hungary, Estonia, can you see the map behind me? Romania, for a very long time, until approximately 1988, 89, when the Iron Curtain started to fall. They were their own country, but ruled by the Soviet Union, the Federation. And so we talked about the Iron Curtain, which was basically a big line right down the middle, separating Austria from Hungary and the rest of Europe above and below. We also talk about the West and the East in that regard. And we'll further talk about that as we go through. We have the United Nations, which doesn't really have much power at all, but is very famous. The League of Nations failed, as you remember, grade 10 history. And the idea was, after the First World War, how can we ever do something to prevent such a horrible atrocity? Well, let's come up with the League of Nations. It didn't work. And then we had even worse Second World War. And after that, they're like, let's really not do this again. So they got together, started the United Nations. Countries can join voluntarily. It's not a government. It has no laws. It has no police or military, though countries do send representatives as peacekeepers under the United Nations flag to around the world, but they're still governed by their own countries. It's a debate on whether or not the United Nations has any power or not. They have influence, again, arguably, but the idea is, and we'll delve deeper into it as we go through this course, the outcome and the reason they exist is to create peace and harmony and discourse between countries, right? So there's a list of countries right there on the unitary nation states: Belgium, Bulgaria, France, etc. Basically, they're a single tier of government with different degrees of power. So it's, as we said, we'll get to it in more detail as we go through this course. Now, like I was talking about in the United States government, the federal and local or state governments typically have separate powers and work differently and separately. In Canada, we see similar ideas between the federal governments and the provincial governments, but the federal government has much more power. Let's use COVID, for example. The COVID rules, if you will, of lockdown have been given to the provincial governments. Hence why if you watch the news, you'll see typically, Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia are seemingly always in the news because they all have such different protocols that have been in place. Quebec has been very lax, didn't really close the schools much in the beginning of this year, and when they did, they opened up pretty fast. They opened up in August for schools. There's no masks that are mandatory. I don't believe that they're doing online learning like we are. Then you look at Ontario, and we have some pretty stringent rules on things, but masks are mandatory in schools, but they're not mandatory in public places. And by that I mean they are mandatory, but if one cannot wear a mask, they are still allowed to enter that public place. And so the government has one idea, and the provinces are there to basically, through their idea, their more direct association with the people, can cater their rules specifically to how things need to be done subnationally, right? And similar to the states, the federal government has their rules, but the different state governments act very much independently. And some states have very relaxed mask wearing rules. In fact, some states have banned masks. Other states have adopted masks as mandatory, et cetera, right? So here there's a little activity. Jot down a few examples of the world's federations as the map appears on the next few slides. Hold on one sec. I don't have any kids to rile up here. Don't go past that. Okay. Don't worry about it. So while we're going through these next examples, just mentally note, obviously you can't really jot them down, but we'll take a look at, federations, etc. So, there are many federations, right? Canada, United States, Canada, again, the basic idea is we have a federal government that either has many or much power or little power. And then there are more localized governments. So that I'm summing it up, right? In Canada's term, we have the provinces. United States, you have the states. In the no longer existing USSR, we had the overall USSR, the centralized government with all the localized countries that were independent at one point in time that are independent again now, and the varying degrees of power in which they are allowed to have from the federal government, right? Australia has states, just like in the United States, et cetera, right? So in North America, of course, we have Canada, United States, and Mexico, but we also have other, there are many other countries in North America, much smaller countries that people don't typically talk about, like the Caribbean countries, etc. Right? In South America as well, Brazil, Argentina, Venezuela, again, central government with their associated federations, right? Nigeria, Ethiopia, South Africa, Comoros, all work the same way, right? You have the one overall country, but within them, the separating political, states, provinces, whatever they chose to call themselves. The Russian Federation, Germany, Belgium, Switzerland, Spain, as well. United Arab Emirates, Pakistan, India, Malaysia, Russia, Australia, right? Anyone name any states in Australia?
Sir, I have a question. How's Switzerland a don't they have like 7 presidents that like take turns being? Is that really considered confederation?
Yes. Oops, did I just turn something off? What just happened? I just pressed something that I shouldn't have pressed. That's the point, right? Each one is very different in the way they conduct themselves. So, that's why I was using America and Canada as an example. We have the federal country, right? Government, the government of Canada. And so from the outside, somebody who does not live in Canada might see Canada as being one country. But in reality, the federal government is just one aspect of the way that we govern ourselves. We have multiple territories and provinces that basically govern the people more so than the federal government, right? So yes, there are federal laws and provincial laws, and of course local laws. For the most part, most laws are done provincially. And in the United States, even more so at the state level. In Australia, the same thing. There are different states: New South Wales, Queensland, Northwest Territories, not Northwest Territories. That's Canada. Something Northern Territories. They're not independent from the country, but the country is a federation of different nations, really. In Canada, if you ever travel to Quebec, one person said they traveled to Quebec this summer. If you're listening to the radio and they're talking about the weather, you might have missed it, but they always deliberately and they always say, in the nation's capital, today is going to be 25 degrees. What do you think they mean by that? The nation's capital. And they're speaking in English if you're listening to English radio. What city is the nation's capital when you're listening to the radio in Quebec?
Ottawa.
Nope.
Are they talking about themselves?
Yeah. Nation's capital is Quebec, Quebec City. Remember, Quebec is a nation within a nation, often described as such. They have even more autonomous allowance from the federal government than or at least they push for it, than the other provinces in Canada, right? And if you recall, we discussed in civics, there was a time when, and even still, there are many separatists in Quebec who would like to, separate from Canada entirely and become their own country outside of our federation, right? So, in a nutshell, that's how the federations of the world work. Now, someone asked Dina about Switzerland specifically. We can get into that later, but I want to get through all this as best we can as a general idea before we go into specifics, right? So is everybody okay and understand what a federation is? Okay. Now, governments by mode of succession. What does succession mean? Well, who becomes the next leader, right? And so, of course, when we think of succession, we think of monarchies and the British Empire. And right now, the leader of the British Empire, the Queen, there's no king. Her husband is a prince. You know, only in fairy tales do you see king and queen. There's always only one, either a king or a queen. Did you guys know that? Anyway, the firstborn son is typically the successor. Now, there have been a number of female queens. Obviously, queen is by definition a female in England. And that has occurred when there is no male successor. And the politics behind that are very specific, especially because if number one choice is the male, then there's a lot of protocol. So notably, Elizabeth I, Queen Victoria, and Elizabeth II, the current reigning monarch. Although in this picture, her son and then his son are pictured as being the successors, Queen Elizabeth does have the power to name her successor. So Prince Charles, that's the guy's name in the middle, might not be the king once Queen Elizabeth dies. And then, of course, if he does become king and then he dies, Prince William would be the king, right? So quite easy. There are definite problems with this type of rule because just because you're born into a family does not mean that you're going to be a good political leader. And so anybody who's studied the history of British monarchs or even European monarchs in general, if you know anything about the Austrian monarchs, the Habsburgs, one thing that happens in this world is a lot of inbreeding. And when humans inbreed, typically there are many mental and physical deformities that occur in the offspring. And it got so bad in the Austrian Habsburg family that basically they died out. You can Google it sometime. You can see like a timeline. The family just gets more and more deformed as the next generation is born. So we have monarchies around the world. Typically, we think of monarchies as being British, but of course, there are monarchies around the world. And of course, there are different names for monarchies too, right? So right now, there are 29 monarchs reigning over 44 countries. And Queen Elizabeth II is the head of state for 16 countries. Notice, so that picture is the 16 countries that she's the head of state, that Canada is there, right? So these are all the countries, but Canada is a part of the British part, I mean, because obviously Sweden up the top there is not part of the British Empire, but they have their own king. But why is Queen Elizabeth, if we are an independent country, why is Queen Elizabeth still on our money? And why is she still the head of our state? Don't we think that the prime minister is the head of our state?
Is it because we're a constitutional monarchy and she's a figurehead?
Yeah, she has no power, but through the negotiations of when we became independent, the British loyalists, even though wanted independence, still wanted ties to Britain, right? Now, reasons for that, one of the biggest would be what?
Support.
Sure, and times of war, right? We still need powerful allies. And so though we needed and wanted, and many countries wanted independence, they didn't want to cut the ties 100% so that in terms of war, just as a thought of respect or something, nah, there's always reasons more than respect when we talk about politics, Tyler, right? You know, protection, money, resources. There really isn't anything else, right? Now, in the United States, we're coming into an election time which is unprecedented because they have a two-term limit, which means that the president can only be president twice. In Canada, we do not have a limit. We can have a prime minister theoretically be voted in every election for as many years as they want, or not as they want, as many years as people want, right? But in the United States, they have stringent terms. They didn't always have these terms. And right now, you know, the president of the United States, Donald Trump, is very vocal about trying to get a third term, even though he hasn't even won the second term yet. Changing the Constitution, this and that. Now, many people laughed when he was running for president the first time, and then they cried. Now, people are still a little weary that, you know, we can't laugh again and disregard the fact that he's running for president, because there's definitely a strong possibility he did it the first time that he will do it again. And there's a lot of talk of changing rules to allow him more power, right? So when we talk about succession, though, we're talking about if somebody dies, what happens, right? So if we go back here, if the queen dies, automatically, no vote, unless otherwise specified, Prince Charles becomes the king. And then if he dies, Prince William. In the United States, if Donald Trump dies, then Mike Pence, the vice president, becomes president. And then if he dies, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi dies, becomes president, and so forth. In Canada, we have election, right? So if somebody dies, the next person is chosen by a party vote or general election. Temporarily, the deputy prime minister, we don't have presidents and things, become the president or prime minister, sorry. Now, of course, in history, we've seen different types of succession. We've seen coup d'etats. We've seen, now, even though Hitler became, he rose to power technically in a democratic way, he used the laws and changed them to his own benefit, thus became chancellor and of course dictator. Mussolini, the same thing. Force was used, and we see this in many countries, and we still kind of see this happening, how somebody becomes the power figurehead. Okay, so we have autocratic and democratic rule. Autocratic, dictatorships, absolute monarchies. The Vatican City is an autocratic rule. One person, the Pope. That's Pope Benedict, the Pope from before. That's a good picture of him. He stepped down, and then Pope Francis became the next Pope. Though they are elected by a group of cardinals, it is still basically you hold that position until you die type of autocratic position. Of course, democratic is different. We have the governor general, prime minister, different purposes, all elected, etc. Right? Governments by structure, monarchy, dictatorship, oligarchy, constitutional. How much would you guys want to just like read your textbook for the next 45 minutes. I know it's a lot to deal with the first class. These are the problem with these 42.5 hour long classes. Okay. How about, or I post something for you to read instead. Give me 1 minute. And then we can continue with this tomorrow. Because obviously this is an 85 slide.
Sir, what would happen with the people that don't have their textbooks?
Well, I'm just looking to see if I can post something to read, actually.
Okay. Would it be possible to pick up the textbooks after school, or does it need to be during school hours?
I have no idea. Well, I'm not going to be able to deliver one for you today. And so far, Mark, Diakonu, and Panthea Ramdell are the only ones that don't have a textbook, correct?
And me, sir.
Tyler.
And Vincenzo.
Yeah, but I've already talked to you about that. Okay, and Tyler, you haven't picked yours up either? I don't know if I left you one. Okay.
Sir, I was also just wondering if there was going to be like testing and.
Oh, okay. So that's a good question. Well, there's no exam. There's going to be a 30% final CPT to be determined what it is, but obviously it'll be assigned soon because this class is over November 11th. And yeah, we're probably going to have some few online tests. I haven't figured out what I'm going to do. I might do like Google Form type tests, but I might kind of do, more typically like essay style questions. And then, so this will be the class 12 to whatever. Halfway through, you'll see me in real life. But because there are people at home all the time, everything has to be done online. So even though you might be in class, you're going to be doing everything the same way that everyone else does online. And yeah, I know everything's very different right now. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Sort of. Okay. So give me 1 moment. I'm going to try to find a reading. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Okay, I'm going to post this thing and you're going to read it. It's 12 pages long. There's a few things you can fill in. It's not going to be an assignment, but fill it in and we can take it up tomorrow. I'm just trying to figure out how to save this. There we go. Why no working? There we go. Okay, I've posted it. Please take a look at that, and then that's what we'll do for the rest of the day. I will be here, obviously till 3 right now, but I'm going to turn my mic and camera off, and then This class is only 3 months. It ends November 11th, and then you switch over. But halfway there, you switch phase 1, phase 2 of the class, right? So if you're in cohort A or B right now, halfway through, which I can't remember what the date is, you come to school, and the second time in the morning instead of the afternoon. I mean, this class is in the morning. And then the whole thing's done November 11th, and we start quadmester 2 and your other 2 courses. Does that make sense? Mariam Hafizi? Okay. Yes. Okay.
Are we required to stay on the?
No, you know what? Let's just all get off. And if you need me, email me.
Okay.
Okay?
Bye.
Anyone have any questions?
So for the textbooks that you left, do we just take one, or are there assigned numbers?
No.
to
If
them?
you go to the front office, there's a pile of textbooks from all different classes. Your name is on the one you get.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Okay. Okay. I'm here for a while if you need anything.